have the pleasure of introducing local legend Barbara DeMarco Barrett, who is, yes, a moment for Barbara, the host of, I think, the longest running literary podcast. Are we at 25 years? Is that right? Something like that. Writers on Writing. Highly suggest, if you're not already subscribers, please find them anywhere podcasts can be found. And we have Melissa Broder with us tonight. Yes. Who needs no introduction, but we are incredibly grateful to have her here with us tonight. Author of Death Valley, most recently, best-selling author. In fact, we've sold out of most of her books that we have, of which we have all of them. They're all sold out tonight. But again, just want to say thank you and hand it off to Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, so let's also give Sam and Mike a round of applause for having this bookstore. We love independent bookstores. So, Melissa, let's start. Before we talk about Death Valley, talk about how you found your way to writing.
Sure. So I also, sorry, I'm late. It was supposed to take like 45 minutes and it took 90. I got lost in the desert on the way here. And so I started writing in third grade poetry and didn't turn to the dark side of fiction until I guess 8 years ago. I started writing prose. When I moved to California, I used to write on the subway in New York City and then started dictating in my car, actually. And my line breaks disappeared and that my language became more conversational. And that's how I started writing prose. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so talk about poetry, though, in terms of how, like, what's the crossover for you to fiction with poetry?
I don't know. It just, the novel form feels to me very poetic. And this book I edited like poetry. So usually for Milk Fed and for the Pisces, I dictated both of those books and, did a lot like, then I'd edit as I moved towards the end. But this book, I really edited on a sentence level as I went along, which is always risky because what if stuff gets cut, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
So, but you didn't have an outline per se.
I always have an outline, but it's sort of like the ship of Theseus. So it's like, all of the parts change, but the outline still remains. So it's like, is it the same ship if you replace all of the parts?
Okay. All right. Okay.
Which I don't know.
So talk about Death Valley and how the book came about.
Sure. So it's definitely a California book. In December of 2020, my father was in a car accident outside of Philadelphia where I am from, and he was in the ICU for 6 months, and it was COVID. So we weren't allowed in to see him for the first couple of months. And he was on life support, in and out of consciousness. And my sister, who lives in Vegas. And so I was trying to escape a feeling of anticipatory grief. I didn't have a name for it. I just thought that like my usual levels of depression and anxiety, which are already considerable, were like spawning new depression and anxiety babies. Like I couldn't figure out what was going on. So I was trying to escape a feeling, unfortunately, feelings inside you. I was driving back and forth from my sister's in Vegas when I was driving through Baker, California, which is home of the world's largest thermometer. And I got this idea. This idea came to me for, that's my dog Pickle. He had to come with he's not in the book. But so I was driving back and forth and I was driving through Baker, and the idea came to me of this cactus where you could get more time with your loved ones. And I then took another desert recon trip as I was kind of about a third of the way writing the book. And I went to Death Valley, and I went to this area called Zabriskie Point, which is a very touristy area. No one gets lost there. I got insanely lost. I was like crying. How long have I been out here? It had been about 45 minutes. And when I made it back to my car and sort of calmed down, I was very grateful because I realized that now I knew what was going to happen and that this was going to be a lost in the desert story. And then I did a lot of research because I did everything wrong when I got lost in the desert for 45 minutes. I only had I had no water with me. I only had Coke Zero with me, and then I read these these hardcore desert survival manuals, and nowhere did they say just bring a little Prada backpack with Coke Zero in it, it's all, but I used those to really plot the book. Finding out how long can you go without water, what kinds of desert plants are edible, how do you know what's poisonous, what's not, build a fire, how do you do this, so I use that as plot points.
Well, one thing that's wonderful about it is that it's a funny grief novel. I mean, how do you be funny with grief, right?
Right.
And it's very funny, which I imagine is right? Your take on things.
Yeah, it's fun. I was writing the other day, and I'm actually right now writing a funny book on suicide. I was sitting down to write, and I was kind of dreading the experience. There's a quote that I love by the violinist Itzhak Perlman. He used to practice 8 hours a day, and somebody said to him, "Isn't that hard?" And he said, "The hardest part is opening the violin case." And I find that the hardest part is opening the document. But if I know that I'm going to be entertaining myself, right, and I know there's going to be humor, it's a more enjoyable experience personally, because I'm sort of staying entertained the whole time. And especially during drafting, the drafting process. Editing, I get very sucked in because it's kind of like playing Tetris. There's a flow, but with drafting, it's very hard for me. As a poet, I'm why would I say in 3 pages what I could, or 300 pages what I could say in 3 pages? Mm-hmm. So the drafting is very difficult. And so, yeah, that's. I think the humor is really to make it enjoyable, so that I enjoy the experience as I'm writing, and then. And there's a lot of books about grief, right? But I read a lot of books about grief after my father died, and I didn't really encounter any funny books about grief. So.
Well, why don't you read?
Okay, great. Yeah, let me do that.
Do you want to, a couple pages would be great.
Yeah. So I'll just read the first couple pages. One. I pull into the desert town at sunset feeling empty. I felt empty the whole drive from Los Angeles and hoped that my arrival would alleviate the emptiness. So when the emptiness is not alleviated, not even momentarily, all emptiness alleviators are temporary. I feel emptier. Help me not be empty, I say to God in the Best Western parking lot. Since I don't turn to God very often, I feel self-conscious when I do. I'm not sure what I'm allowed to ask for, and I worry that I shouldn't want the things I want. Are my requests too specific? I should probably ask to simply be happy doing God's will, though I've heard it said that when you're doing God's will, you feel like you're flowing with a great river, not against it, so it seems like the happy feeling should just come naturally. Earlier today, a friend texted me a quote by Kierkegaard. Life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. Ordinarily, I do nothing more than mark this kind of text message with a heart, maybe respond with the word yes, and move on. But because of the low place I've been in, I saw the quote as a life raft, as though I were a small version of me adrift in a bowl of milk, and the quote was the lone Cheerio I had to grab onto. Halfway between LA and the desert town, I stopped at a Circle K to pee and get some beef jerky. On the public toilet, I tried to meditate using the Kierkegaard quote as a mantra, but the quote only made me feel worse. I realized that I was doing the exact opposite of what the quote suggested, trying to solve a problem, the problem of me and my mood, rather than just experiencing it. But how do you just experience things? In addition to the beef jerky, Jack Link's brand Sweet and Hot, I bought a large cup of black coffee and 2 cans of Red Bull sugar-free, a decision that is now coming back to haunt me in the motel parking lot. Some bad electricity is going down in my nervous system, and I can't tell what's caffeine-induced sensitivity and what could be a real physical problem. When I look at the glowing blue welcome sign, it appears to be vibrating. The Best Western is at the edge of town. The Best Western's like a huge character in this book. As is the Best Western grab and go breakfast is like basically a protagonist. And beyond it lies nothingness, a desolate stretch of sand and rock, peppered with dead brush all the way to the hills. I play it fake cool to the dust, casually unloading my black duffel from the trunk. But my hands are trembling. Am I dying? This thought triggers an unexpected surge of tenderness, as though I am a child who needs comforting. In the settling dusk, I try to think of a positive self-affirmation, the kind that one woman I know has written on Post-its stuck to her bathroom mirror, a behavior that makes me judge her as a person, though there's really nothing wrong with it, and I wish I didn't. What I come up with is, you have a good reason to be depressed. The phrase serves as a soothing reminder that my doominess isn't baseless. I am going to clutch it like a blankie as I move through the gloom, deeper and more alarming than my typical sea levels. My raison to depression, if I were to convey it briefly in an email, is thus. Hi. 5 months ago, my father was critically injured in a car accident. Unfortunately, he is still in the ICU. As a result, I am overextended and cannot fulfill your request at this time. Best, me. One nice thing about a tragic situation is having an excuse to say no to everything. Nothing says don't ask me for shit like ICU. It's simple, effective, succinct. At the same time, my prevailing compulsion is to recount every stage of the whole ordeal, as though by omission, I'll fail to convey the prolonged awfulness of the situation, or worse, I'll lose some of the time in which my father and I have existed on earth together. Okay, I'll stop.
So we've been talking about beginnings a lot lately. What first pages, first lines. Talk about getting that first line, that wonderful first line, and then the first chapter. Like, what sort of work did you put into that, and how important was it for you?
Very important. The first line came to me. The first line was a gift. The last couple lines were, don't skip ahead, but the last couple lines were also like a gift. Like I remember where I was when I came with the last couple lines. I was like, yes. Because you never, it's like, how am I going to get out of this? But the first line, the first couple of lines came to me when I was driving in the desert. And then the first chapter, I probably re-edited. I mean, I don't know, total 100 times, who knows? But it's really like chiseling a diamond. Because I don't know, it makes me feel safe to have a first chapter that I feel like is good, that I feel good about.
Sure.
Yeah, it's sort of like having a support.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the last few lines, actually, the last chapter, because it was unexpected. And I don't know, the word redemptive is not one I really like to use. I don't really like to even talk about redemptive endings, but it ended on like an upbeat.
I'll try to address that without doing a spoiler for people who haven't read it. I knew where the ending would go. I would say that the book is really, here's what I'll say. Like the book, one of the themes in the book is the difference between empathy and compassion. She and her husband get into sort of a fight about the difference between empathy and compassion. And a lot of the book is also about how do you not take someone else's death personally? And as I understand it, empathy is where we can sort of understand where a person is coming from and feel for them. Whereas compassion is simply that feeling of emotional generosity that we extend when we maybe don't relate, right? It's not relatable, as the term we all use nowadays. And so for me, and a lot of it too is the ways that we can kind of project ourselves onto other people's life experiences, right? And through getting lost in the desert, my protagonist comes to understand a little bit more about what her father's going through in the ICU and not take his responses and reactions to her personally, and also what her husband, who has a chronic illness, goes through her own physical suffering in the desert and what she experiences. And so the ending, I wanted the ending to reflect that.
So how much did you work on that last chapter?
Quite a bit. Yeah. Actually, the second to last chapter came to me. I had like an experience. In the second to last chapter, there's she has an encounter with a rose, with some roses. Maybe it's the third to last chapter, with some roses. And there's a lot of of nature in the book because I needed characters because she's alone. So I was like, all right, talking rocks, the bunnies, right? The bird, mustache Oriole. Yeah. So I needed characters. And so the earth became my characters and animals became my characters. And, but so a rose, she has an encounter with a rose and, or with some roses, and it's an exploration of mortality and, what happens. And that it's funny, that was really influenced by a plant in my backyard that I felt like I'm not like I'm not a person who really talks to trees. It's just not, like the moon and I don't, my protagonist actually also talks about the moon and her don't have like, a lot of times poets have like a really deep like connection with the moon. Like the moon and I aren't BFF, and, but I did have this experience with these plants in my backyard when I was thinking a lot about death and what happens. And after my dad had died, and, that sort of became the rose. And then recently I was in my mother's backyard and my father's hydrangea, my father was a gardener and his hydrangeas were blooming. And I was talking to my niece who's is 3 at the time. And we were looking at the hydrangeas and I was saying, and they go back to the earth and then they become something else. And, and that's, I think like I was kind of giving her third to last chapter.
So the protagonist doesn't have a name.
Nope.
So how come?
Well, I don't know. I sort of feel like there's something mythic and about having no names for the big characters. And then I have these auxiliary characters who do have names like Jethro and Zip, which I took from the Bible, Jethro and Zipporah. I used a lot of the story of Exodus. Like no one would ever know if they didn't hear me talk about it. I don't think, but she references Moses and there's like a scene where she finds a Gideon's Bible in the motel room at Best Western. But for the most part, like you wouldn't really know how much of Exodus is sort of seated, but it's a Lost in the Desert story. And I wanted to like build in richness using that. So, so I used Exodus, but for her, that namelessness, I don't know. I just liked it. I liked her husband has no name. He's her husband, her father, her mother, her sister, right? Like these basic characters. And the book that I'm actually writing right now is in a way, it could be seen as a sequel, although it could be a standalone, and it's the same protagonist, again, nameless. Although it was funny because I only read my 5-star Goodreads reviews. I don't read any of the other ones. And somebody wrote a really nice review, and then they said, and this is a book about a woman named Esther. And I was like, is her name Esther? Like, did I accidentally name? And I'm like, oh, okay, her name isn't Esther, but I guess, I don't know. That was this woman's interpretation. So she might actually have a name, and I just didn't name her.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think she does.
Yeah, I don't think she does.
So as you were talking, I was thinking of something that I just totally forgot, but it had to do with the Best Western. Like, and the Best Western is something that you like. It's a place you like, right? You like the breakfast, the grab and go. And so the husband, that's what I was going to ask you about. Like, we never really see him, right? I mean, at the end, he's there sort of in the end, but he's not really. I mean, he goes looking for her or something. So what role did you bring him into play?
It's a good question. I think, I wanted, the protagonist has this relationship with her father who's in a coma where, in and out of a coma, where the father is kind of like back off. I want to be alone, basically. Like he's a very private person and he like doesn't want to be seen in this light so much. And she's like dying to get in there because she's like, they had sort of a change in their relationship when she was in her early 20s where their relationship really changed due to his own depression, which she took personally. And then so she kind of feels like if she can like almost rescue her father, then like she'll be the magic daughter, right? And so she's like dying to get in there. Like she just wants to be in and like a big part of what he's going through. And her husband has a chronic illness and he like really wants her to be there for him. And it's sort of this flip side where because she's being like asked to be there, right? And it's like this different type of a sense of responsibility. She feels like very afraid that if she is like super present, that she's going to get like sucked into this vortex of illness. So in a way, it's different ways of examining the personalization, the ways we can personalize other people's challenging experiences, and they sort of serve as foils to one another. Oh, there's the husband. Yeah.
So, okay. So the father, I mean, there's a lot of autobiographical stuff in the novel,
Yes,
right?
a lot.
So, and you've written essays. Did you consider writing a memoir?
No, I've decided that I don't think I'm going to do another personal nonfiction book until I'm like dead, basically. I spent the past year, I did a journal project. I was trying to sort of find like a home inside myself, so to speak. And I found that it was only making me progressively more obsessed with I was trying to find my way out of depression, anxiety. And I found that by keeping this journal, it was making me more and more focused on it. So by like month 10, I gave that up. But I'm using that I'm weaving that into my next novel. So I think what I love is using elements from my life as a sort of basis, but then doing like a send up of autofiction. Like when I was recording the audiobook for this, the audio engineer was like, is this based on a true story? Like after I'd finished reading the book and I was like, yes, I went inside a magic cactus and encountered all of my loved ones as children and spoke to Bunny, so it's sort of, there's, I like that idea of using a character who has some of my DNA as a springboard. The writer Philip Roth is a big North Star for me. He's, he wrote a lot of books, and not all of his books are my favorites, but several are. And Portnoy's was definitely an inspiration for Milk-Fed, Portnoy's Complaint. Sabbath Theater is probably my favorite. And I love Goodbye Columbus because I love longing. Yeah. Are you a Philip Roth fan?
Not really. I mean, I don't dislike him, but I've been trying to find what to read of his that I haven't read him in years and years.
Yeah. He's a Sabbath Theater is filthy and wonderful. I've also been revisiting Operation Shylock, actually, because that book is really, it's an exploration of his own complicated feelings as a Jewish American about Israel. And there's a Philip Roth impersonator, which actually, this is why I'm mentioning Philip Roth. In that book, there's a Philip Roth impersonator who is in Israel at the moment and very pro-Israeli. And he's like, I don't know how I feel about this, and but the reason why I bring up Philip Roth is he did these Nathan Zuckerman books where he has this alter ego, Nathan Zuckerman. And I feel like this protagonist is sort of an alter ego. And there's several books and they can be read as standalones or not. So I feel like this character is going to be, for me, this unnamed character is going to be appearing again.
Excellent. Well, I think didn't you put a novel aside to work on this? You were working on something and it went in the drawer. Talk about that.
So it's basically, it's a novel that I wrote before I wrote my last novel, Milk-Fed, and then put in a drawer because it just wasn't working, and then took back out again, and then realized I don't really want to ever publish this. It's just, I don't love it. It's called The Man Upstairs. And what I did was I cannibalized The Man Upstairs. I used it for this. So this protagonist is a writer, and the book she is writing is about a couple who are living in Venice Beach and become romantically obsessed with with this skater surfer who lives upstairs. And she has to figure out a way to write the desert section of this book, in which there was actually a desert section of The Man Upstairs where where the protagonist goes to a music festival and in the desert and has a very bad trip. And so this protagonist is trying to figure out the desert section of that novel. So I sort of use that novel as like in a meta way within this book.
And there was another book that was really influential, Ed Abbey.
Yes, Edward Abbey, Desert Solitaire, highly recommend if you want a good desert novel. It's beautiful. Well, it's actually not a novel, it's a memoir. Nonfiction, gorgeous. I probably read it 4 times. He was a brilliant man. And he was an East Coaster like me, and he would go out to the desert every summer. And actually, I don't think it was summer. I think it was in the winter that he would go. And he was because it was very desolate, and he was a park ranger there. And so it was like this very like East Coast meets, and it was in Utah. And his work is incredibly beautiful.
Are there any questions? Kelly?
Hi, can you talk about anticipatory grief?
Yeah.
Anticipatory grief. I guess we should repeat for the recording.
Anticipatory grief. Sure. So I didn't know what that was. I didn't know there was like such a thing. And there were experiences I was having where I was like, why do I feel like my father has already died, but he's still alive? And my friend Sarah, who is so Reddit is like a Greek chorus in this book. I use the website Reddit. I love Reddit. I shouldn't love Reddit. I Google my health symptoms on there far too often and get myself into trouble. But I love Reddit. Reddit is the Greek chorus of this book. And so she's Pickleball Sarah in this book. That's like a little Easter egg for you. And Sarah said my friend Sarah had lost her mom about a year or two before I lost my dad. And she was like, it's called anticipatory grief. That's what you're feeling. And I didn't know that such a thing existed. And so this book is really an exploration of that experience. And the desert can be seen as a metaphor for that, because I think not just for anticipatory grief, but for grief itself, with the desert, and grief, you feel lost. It's desolate, it's barren, but then there's also these like beautiful oases we can find there.
So speaking of Reddit, and social media, et cetera, I think there's like debate among some of my friends, writer friends, whether to bring in, things that are so current that will date the material. Maybe we talked about this on the show.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? I mean, obviously you don't have a problem with it, but did you consider that? Like, should I bring it in? Should I not bring it in? Am I going to date this material? I mean, what do you think?
Well, it's funny because with my poetry, I was always a purist. Like I only wanted nouns that could have been understood like 400 years ago. I don't know. I mean, I guess I was just much more of a snob about my poems. With prose, I had a poetry teacher who said to me, and this goes for like a lot, I feel like this extends to a lot of my writing. She was like, if you teach the reader how to live in the universe of the poem, you can do whatever you want. And I feel like the same is true of a novel. Like someone might not understand or Reddit may no longer be relevant, but it has the flavor of the time. And I think like if you make good use of what you put in a book, like Chekhov's Reddit, right? Like, if you introduce Reddit must go off. And so I really tried in this book to make good use of everything I introduced. So everything I introduced serves a function. The grab and go breakfast serves a function. A blueberry muffin serves a function, right? Like if it's anything that gets introduced, it serves a function. Her British publisher, Mary Pig Ratliff, serves a function. And so Reddit too serves a function. And I think that like by sort of utilizing what you have again and again throughout a text, you can it can earn its keep.
Sure.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Jen?
I just had a question about
Sure.
the nature and anthropomorphizing stuff. Was there at any point when the nature started to speak to you? You were no longer writing about it.
It's a really good question. There's talking rocks in the book. They have names. They're pink, gray, the egg. It looks like an egg. It's a rock. They're all named after what they look like. And door. It looks like a translucent door, this rock. And they really took on a life of their own, for sure. Also, I think that the talking rose that I mentioned, that really did come to me from a talking plant. The plant didn't actually speak to me. I'm sober. I've been sober for 19 years. So the plant did not actually speak to me, as far as I know, but there was a feeling of that. And yeah, I think that like these great characters, there's rabbits, teen rabbits. And I feel like I got inside the teen rabbits' heads, or they got into mine. So yeah, absolutely. I think, nature can speak to us in different ways. And for me, sometimes it's yelling at me or like these rocks. Each one is very helpful. Gray is very helpful. Pink is very sarcastic, very bitchy. The egg, also not very nice. And door is sort of like a kind of like like an annoying college philosopher, you know, like somebody at university, like taking acid for the first time. Yeah.
Any other questions? There must be one.
Yes.
Anne.
Can you talk a little bit about just your writing process, like what your writing day looks like?
Today looked like no writing, though there was supposed to be. Yesterday, not enough writing, though there was supposed to be. You know, what I usually do typically is I sort of establish a certain amount of time that I'm going to be writing each day. And I'm not an Itzhak Perlman. I'm not somebody, when I'm editing, I can spend like, you know, like when I'm in the final stages of a book, I can spend like 8 to 10 hours for sure. But in the drafting process and in the earlier editing process, when I sort of don't know quite 100% where I'm going ahead, I have to break it down into really small chunks. So I give myself, I'm like, okay, you will just write for an hour today. And a lot of times I go longer, but it can be really that small of an amount of time that I set for myself. And with my first novel, The Pisces, I really didn't know if I could write a novel. You know, I'd never done it before. I had written poems and I had written these essays. And so I decided that I would dictate 3 paragraphs a day. And by dictating 3 paragraphs a day, I had a rough draft within like 9 months. So, and it's not that short of a book. So, you know, I think it can be done in a lot smaller increments. But yeah, for me, it's the drafting process is the hardest for in terms of just like sitting down to do it.
Okay, one second, because I'm going to forget this if I don't ask you now. Right at the beginning, you talked about, I think, using your phone, dictating, and then the lack of line breaks helping you find your voice.
Yeah.
Could you say more about that?
Sure. So poetry, we break lines, and a lot of times I would use syllabics. So that's just like I would count syllables to know when to break. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. And then when I was dictating, there were no more line breaks. So it really just became like chunks of text. And rather than it being a prose poem, I felt like, wow, this is really conversational. These are essays, lo and behold. So it was very organic how I started writing prose.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay, Jen.
I just wanted to say, do you have readers, like people you trust to read your work before allow your process?
Yeah, so my husband is always my first reader. He's an amazing editor. It's not Pickle is always on my lap. He's sort of my secretary. It's like I don't write at a desk. I sit like on this sort of chaise lounger thing. And so it's like me, legs crossed, Pickle, a pillow, and then my laptop on top of the pillow. So Pickle's sort of swaddled in there. But yeah, so my husband is always my first set of eyes. And then there's a friend of mine, Kate Durbin, a writer friend. Sometimes I've had her do some reading. And then usually it goes right to my agent. Yeah, my agent is an amazing editor. So she'll go really, really hard in the editing. Although for this book, when I turned it into her, I felt like it was really clean and she felt like it was really clean. And then my editor felt like it was very clean. But that did not happen with my first 2 novels. I think you become better at editing your own work over time. You know, I mean, like I did do an MFA and workshops for years and things like that. But yeah, no, it's really my husband will do like 1 or 2 rounds. He's the first person to say like whether it's actually a viable book, you know, which is always a very nerve-wracking thing. And then my agent, it's always very scary. But she's creatively, has a real like passion for the word, which I know sounds weird, like a weird thing to say about an agent, because you would think like, well, don't they all? But I think that, you know, an agent is a business person, and then there's, you know, the creative end. And so, yeah.
I know you talked about meditating before.
Yeah.
So, and I also went to your Zoom workshop.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, of course, it was awesome. Yes, I was wondering if you could talk about meditating and how it maybe impacts your writing, or, you know, revelations come to you, and then also if you were able to continue meditating while you were grieving?
Good questions. Definitely meditated my way through grief. Still meditating, still grieving sometimes. And the way that meditation has impacted my work, I think that for the drafting process, it really it allows me to become a channel and to get out of my own way. That's like the best way that I could describe it. But there's also, I think that even in the editing process, I've used meditation. So for example, about a year and a half ago, I was doing these. I love the free library app Libby, and they have the audiobook. Yeah, it's like all you can eat audiobooks. It's great. If you have a library card, you can get it. I love it. And I found this weird book on like Siberian shamanic meditation, and I'm of Russian origin, so like I thought this was really interesting. And I was doing these guided meditations, and actually it was longer ago than that. It was like 2.5 years ago. And one of the meditations was you travel to the realm, and like they ask, how are you going to travel up there? And you can you can go up on a smokestack, or you can go up on a rainbow. You have to ask it a question. And my question was, how do I know my dad is still with me? And then, and I had Pickle on my lap, and then like I ended up visualizing like flying up on a bird, and that was just what I visualized. And I like wrote down like bird in a document, and then just kind of like, when I'm writing, I keep like all these documents, and one is sort of like a repository of ideas that might go in, might not. And later, about a year later, I was editing the book, and I was trying to figure out, how do I get her up this mountain, this character? Like, she's injured. What do I do? And I was like, oh, she can fly up on a bird, which like, but then you can't just have the bird appear, right? So then I had to build the bird backwards into the narrative, and its name is Mustache Oriole. Yeah, but I couldn't just have like I said, like I feel like you have to earn it. So I seeded the bird in from the beginning, and it was very much in keeping with the tone of the book, right? Like it wasn't like a hyper realistic book and suddenly a bird appears and she flies up on it. Like the whole book, there's a lot of blurring. You know, she's already been inside a magic cactus. Like it's okay that she's flying on a bird.
Well, I hope you do more episodes of your podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, I should. I just kind of thanks. Oh, thank
I
you.
take it in my car and listen to it, so it's like, you know,
Awesome.
and it's like in a cool.
My car just got decimated by a mudslide. Yeah.
Right. How is your car in your house?
It's car totaled, but we have a rental and insurance is going to cover it. And yeah, I was like, but now I know what's going to happen in my next book. It was like a gift. I wasn't sure what the big kahuna was going to be for the next book. I was like, this is, no one needs to like hear the insides of my head anymore. Like what's going to be the big, and then we got like hit by a mudslide and we're on the local news. So yeah.
So
Not
were
me personally, but the car and my garage.
Were you in the house when this happened?
Yes, we slept through it. But when we woke up in the morning, we were buried. It's on my Instagram, Real Melissa Broder, if you want to watch the clip on KTLA.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I really resonated with what you said about finding like humor and grief. And I was wondering if you felt comfortable saying some examples of like humorous moments you found early in the grief process, and maybe like what the seeds of that and what inspired you to write more about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I always think of this story. It's funny to me. My sister and I, my dad, there was like a goals of care meeting where we were finally allowed in to see him because the doctor and nurse thought he was going to die. We got there, he was like gone. And then like 2 days later, he's sort of awake, which was baffling. And I was like, don't tell dad that I thought we should pull the plug. So that was like the first, because I thought it was like the kind thing to do. I was like, I was like, are we prolonging his life or are we prolonging his death? And then like 2 days later, he's expressing no desire to die. And I was just like, do not tell him. And then he got transferred. He ended up having to go back to the ICU and was there for months and months again, but before he passed, but he ended up getting transferred to this rehab facility. And it was, my sister and I were still home in Philadelphia, and it was snowing. And they never called us to say that he had arrived. and I mean, the man like was, he was on like a ventilator and a feeding tube. So he wasn't walking there. And it was midnight and my sister and I are like, they never called, like, where's dad? They've lost dad. And my mom at this point, this was when the vaccine had just come out and my mother was like obsessed with getting the vaccine. Like all of her friends had gotten it and she hadn't gotten it. So we were like, Mom, we don't know where dad is. And she just like wakes up and she's like, call CVS. Like she's just obsessed. Like all she can think about, because that was how she was handling grief, was by focusing on the vaccine or like getting him the right sweatpants for rehab, which is in the book. Like she's obsessed with these sweatpants. So my sister and I are like, they lost dad. Like, where is he? So we get in the car at midnight and we're like, and it's snowing out. We're like, dad would kill us right now if he knew what we were doing. He'd be like, there's black ice. Like, what are you doing? Which on the East Coast mean very dangerous terrain. We show up at this rehab facility at midnight during COVID. Everyone's wearing masks. And we're like, is Robert Broder there? And they're like, he is. And then we're like, could we just like maybe go see him? And they were just like, no, like nobody was allowed in basically. So we were trying to like worm our way in. So it was just this whole odyssey, we had a good time, even though it was a total disaster. My sister and I had a good time. Yeah.
Any other questions? Candy.
You said something about teaching your reader the universe of the novel. How do you do that? Like with something so fantastical like this, how do you get them to?
It's a good question. I don't know 100%. However, what I will say is, again, it's like that the Chekhov's gun idea, but backwards, right? So if a gun goes off, introduce it early, right? Like Chekhov's gun is if a gun is introduced, the gun has to go off. So for me, it's like everything that sort of becomes part of like a desert rescue, right? Or a wild flight of fancy. Like, for example, this is a character who goes inside a giant cactus. By chapter 2, she's eating in a Mexican restaurant, talking about like a neon cactus on the wall, explaining her relationship to it, like to cacti. She's just gotten into houseplants because her father was a gardener. So it's sort of like, I felt like I had to earn this magic cactus by having this be a character who's doing a lot of thinking about nature and plants. Similarly, like with my book, The Pisces, the protagonist encounters a merman. She's a Sapphic scholar, right? So she's very steeped in Greek myth. If she had been like a nurse or like, working at In-N-Out Burger or somebody who wasn't thinking about Greek myth a lot, she might not have been as likely to perceive this character. But this is someone who's thinking a lot about Greek mythology. So I think, yeah, it's like seeding it into the world, right? Earning it. When I was writing this book, I knew the cactus had to be a saguaro. Like I was like, it's going to be a giant saguaro. And I then found out that the saguaros don't grow in California. Now, it's a magical saguaro, right? She's going inside. Technically, it doesn't really matter that saguaros don't grow in California, but it matters to me. So I was like, well, if there's going to be a magic cactus, like we got to talk about the fact that saguaros don't grow there. I can't just like pretend that they do. So on Reddit, there's like a whole fight that breaks out in botany Reddit about like, whether like somebody's like, I saw a saguaro in California and I have the receipts, So basically like there's an internet fight before she ever sees the giant saguaro. So that's what I mean. Just like, right. Like earning it. Yeah.
And then there's also, she and her husband have a little argument over Dante.
Yes.
Talk about Dante.
So Dante and Primo are their two peace lilies, and they get in a fight about the peace lilies because she's gotten really obsessed with house plants. That was another funny thing about grief. Like my mother was obsessed with sweatpants and the COVID vaccine, and I couldn't stop buying house plants. Like I was just buying more and more. Like my house was like a plant orphanage. It was getting crazy. So this protagonist is getting obsessed with house plants, and basically there's one that is not doing very well, and she and her husband, this is how the grief, the empathy, compassion part comes in. They get in a fight over this plant, but it's not really about the plant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
I love Dante.
Dante, the dying. He doesn't look good.
No.
We have a Dante actually and a Primo. So.
Rosalia.
You borrow a lot from, the grief you went through. Did you find in writing, even though it is a fictionalized version, that there were places you just couldn't go? Or that because it's so different, it kind of unblocked what you're going through in your life?
There was nowhere I couldn't go, but I will say that once I finished the book, like I remember there was a day when I was getting towards the end of editing, like before I turned it in. Actually, it was after I'd done like some rounds of edits with my agent and then was turning it into my publisher to see if they would want to buy it. And when I finished it at that point, like it felt mostly done to me. And I was, the whole time I was writing, I felt like I had this forward propulsion with my father, even though he had been dead for over a year by the time I finished the book. But when I finished it, I was like, oh, he's not coming back. So in a way, it was harder for me to not be writing it. Writing it, it was like this excitement. And the day I sold the book, selling this book, I wasn't as excited as I was when I sold The Pisces and Milk Fed. Maybe because it's my third book, but I don't think that's it. I think that there was something like this book had a sort of, has a sadness to it to me, Yeah.
So talk about the title, Death Valley, because it obviously means a couple of different things here.
Yes.
But at what point did the title come?
Well, so after I got lost in Death Valley, because the book takes place in between Death Valley and the Mojave Desert, and I was going to call it In the Valley of Death Valley, and my husband was like, "Why don't you just call it Death Valley?" And I was like, "Okay." Yeah, so it was going to be called In the Valley of Death Valley, just like Pisces was going to be called Pisces Rising, and he was like, "Why don't you just call it the Pisces?" And I was like, "You're right." But then I was like, "Yeah, Death Valley," and then I was like, Death Valley, like the Valley, like it's sort of, sometimes these things come and it's just like a gift, you're just like, so, because this is a protagonist who is very much walking in, the shadow of the Valley of Death and examining, she's like on the precipice, she's sort of walking around grief and, but also I was very excited.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's a great title. Rosalia.
You talk about your husband. Does he have a writing background, or is he?
He does. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? I always have to ask about the cover as well. At what point did you see it, and did you have any input in the cover?
I did. So the first cover was not this cover. It was like totally different. Wasn't right. And, a publisher really wants the writer to like their cover because they want us to be happy and be excited to promote the book, right? Like if you don't like your cover, you're kind of going to be like, eh. So then they said to me, okay, we're going to have another designer do it. This guy, Alex Murto. And Alex Murto is a friend of mine who they didn't know that he was my friend. He had actually done one of my earliest poetry books. I had like literally commissioned him because my publisher, like there's no money in poetry. It does not make it rain. And so, my publisher, like what he had come up with was a disaster. And I was working at Penguin Books at the time. I used to work as a book publicist, and and Alex Murto worked there, and I knew him, and I asked him like, hey, could I pay you like a small sum to do? So I knew him. And so when they said he was going to do it, I love his work. And I was so excited. And then they showed this to me and I was just like, because I like a cover that has tension, right? Like the first cover they showed me was too on the nose. And I think a good cover to me is something that you look at twice and you're like, what's going on here? With the nipple, with my Milk Fed cover, I first looked at it and at first I thought it was a 45 record, and then I was like, oh, right. It's a nipple. Yeah. And then we that cover I knew was right away. Although we workshopped several different nipple sizes. So there was like very, and and like my guy friend Jean was like, go with the big, and then like my girlfriends were like, go with the smaller, and so yes, we had to workshop the nipple, but I knew that cover was right. Yeah, I like a cover with like some tension to it. Yeah, a little odd.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, I think we should all thank Melissa for being here, coming from LA.
Barbara, thank you so much both for your podcast and for this. I really appreciate it.